movie about knights gets almost everything wrong. The gleaming armor, the honorable duels, the chivalric code followed without question. The truth is that becoming a knight required you to spend most of your childhood as a servant. It required you to learn how to fight in equipment that weighed more than most people could lift. It required you to go to war for a lord whose interests had nothing to do with yours. And when the fighting was over, it required you to go home and manage an estate with almost no income. The movies show you the tournament and the victory and the grateful kingdom. They do not show you the decades of training, the debt, the injuries, and the legal obligations. This is what your life as a medieval knight actually looked like. Part 1. How you became a knight. You did not decide to become a knight. Your family decided for you, usually when you were around 7 years old. At that age, you were sent away from your home to serve in the household of a noble family. This arrangement was called being a page, and it was the first rung of a very long ladder. As a page, you served at table, ran errands, and learned basic manners and horsemanship. You also began learning how to handle weapons, starting with wooden practice swords and gradually moving to heavier equipment. Around age 14, you became a squire, which was a significant step up in responsibility. A squire was assigned to a specific knight and became that knight's personal attendant in almost every sense. You cleaned his armor, cared for his horses, carried his equipment on campaign, and rode beside him into battle. The relationship was not equal, and the squire was not treated as an equal. You were a servant with career prospects, which is a different thing from being valued. Squires were expected to learn by watching and doing, rather than by being formally taught. If your knight was killed in battle, you dealt with the consequences of that loss immediately and alone. The formal ceremony of knighthood came somewhere between age 18 and 21 if things went well. It required the approval of an existing knight or a senior noble to proceed. The ceremony involved a vigil, prayers, and the dubbing of the sword on your shoulder. What it did not involve was any guarantee of income, land, or ongoing employment. You were now a knight with obligations and almost nothing else to show for it. Part 2. The armor and what it actually did to you. Medieval plate armor at its peak in the 14th and 15th centuries was a remarkable piece of engineering. A full harness of plate armor weighed between 15 and 25 kilograms depending on the period and the maker. That weight was distributed across the entire body rather than concentrated in one place. This meant a fit trained knight could move more freely in armor than most people assume. He could run, mount a horse without assistance, and perform reasonably complex physical movements. The problem was not the weight distribution, the problem was the heat. Plate armor had no ventilation system of any kind. The metal absorbed heat from sunlight and from the physical exertion of the person wearing it. In summer campaigns, knights regularly suffered from heat exhaustion before any fighting had even begun. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the French knights were significantly slowed by the weight of mud. Many of them fell and could not stand up again because the armor restricted their movement in soft ground. They were killed while lying on the ground, unable to rise by English soldiers with simple weapons. The armor that was supposed to protect them contributed directly to their deaths. Maintaining armor was also a constant and expensive responsibility. Steel rusted quickly in damp northern European climates. A squire spent significant portions of his time polishing, repairing, and treating armor against corrosion. A single damaged piece could render the entire harness ineffective in combat. Replacing damaged pieces required access to a skilled armorer and significant amounts of money. Most knights did not have significant amounts of money available at any given point. Part 3. What actual combat looked like. The tournament version of knightly combat that appears in films was a heavily regulated sporting event. Real medieval combat was nothing like it. A battlefield in the medieval period was chaotic, loud, and deeply disorienting. There were no clear lines of sight, no organized formations visible from ground level, and no coherent communication. You could not see the overall shape of the battle from inside it. You knew what was happening within a few meters of your position, and nothing beyond that. Knights in battle did not engage in honorable one-on-one duels with worthy opponents. They fought whatever was in front of them, often multiple opponents at once, in extremely close quarters. The goal was not to kill your opponent, but to capture him for ransom whenever possible. A captured knight of high status was worth a significant sum, and ransoms were a primary source of income. This created a specific and unusual incentive structure inside medieval battle. You wanted to subdue your opponent quickly without killing him, because a dead knight produced no ransom payment. The weapons used in actual battle were not the elegant swords of film. The most effective weapons against plate armor were blunt instruments like the warhammer and the mace. These weapons worked by transmitting force through the armor rather than cutting through it. A powerful blow from a warhammer could fracture bones through intact plate without penetrating it at all. Daggers were used to find gaps in the armor at close range once an opponent was down. Battle was a physical ordeal that lasted hours and left survivors exhausted and frequently injured. The romantic version of knights in combat was created by people who had never stood in a medieval battle. Part 4. The Obligations and the Cost. A knight's primary legal obligation was to provide military service to his lord. This service was owed for a specific number of days per year, typically 40 days. Beyond those 40 days, the knight was technically free to leave and go home. In practice, leaving a campaign in progress before your lord considered it finished had significant consequences. The relationship between a knight and his lord was not a friendship or a partnership. It was a formal legal arrangement with serious penalties for failure to comply. Knights who held land held it as a gift from their lord that could be revoked. Failure to perform military service when required was grounds for losing that land entirely. The cost of military service was also largely borne by the knight himself. You provided your own horse, your own armor, your own weapons, and your own food for the campaign. The horses required for knightly service were expensive warhorses bred specifically for combat. A destrier, the primary warhorse used in battle, cost the equivalent of several years of a skilled craftsman's wages. If your horse was killed in battle, you were expected to replace it at your own expense. Horse casualties in medieval battles were extremely high. A knight who lost several horses in a single campaign could be financially ruined by that campaign. The income from land held by a minor knight was typically modest and irregular. A bad harvest year meant the income dropped substantially with no alternative source available. Many knights spent their careers in a state of ongoing financial stress that films never show. Part 5. The Reality of the Chivalric Code. The chivalric code is the part of knighthood that popular culture finds most appealing. The idea that knights operated under a strict moral framework of honor, courtesy, and protection of the weak. The historical reality of the chivalric code is considerably more complicated than the popular version. Chivalry was primarily a code of conduct governing how knights treated each other. It had relatively little to say about how knights treated common people, peasants, or the populations of conquered territories. The 100 Years' War between England and France produced extensive documented evidence of what knights actually did. English and French knights regularly participated in the burning of villages, the destruction of crops, and the killing of civilians. This practice was called the chevauchée, and it was a deliberate military strategy. The point was to destroy the agricultural base of enemy territory and undermine the economic power of rival lords. Knights who participated in chevauchées were not violating the chivalric code. They were following orders from lords who considered this a legitimate and effective form of warfare. The chivalric code protected knights from other knights. It offered no protection to anyone who was not part of the knightly class. The tournaments, the courtly love poetry, and the elaborate ceremonies were real. They existed alongside systematic violence against civilian populations as a normal part of medieval warfare. The code was a set of manners within a class, not a universal moral framework. Understanding this does not make medieval knights into villains. It makes them into people who operated inside a value system that was different from the one film's project onto them. The medieval knight was a professional military specialist in a world that needed professional military specialists. He trained from childhood, invested his family's resources in expensive equipment, and placed his body in genuine danger. He operated inside a legal system that could strip him of everything he owned if he failed to comply. He fought in conditions of extreme physical hardship with no clear view of what was happening around him. He came home from campaigns exhausted, sometimes injured, sometimes financially worse than when he left. He managed land with modest income and constant obligations to a lord who held all the real power. The gleaming armor in those ceremonies was genuinely real. The honor was real, within the boundaries of who the code considered worth honoring. The rest of it was considerably harder and considerably less romantic than anything you have seen in a cinema.